I apologize. My Spanish is not as good as it could be for a presentation that is this technical. It is truly an honor to be here, and I want to thank Ms. Guzman for contacting me in Washington and bringing me here. One of the first things I'd like to discuss with you is the perspective that I provide. My views represent not only my work at the U.S. Department of Commerce, but they also represent experience in the private sector, experience with the American Bar Association section of international law, where I have worked on rule of law development in many countries. So the perspective I'm going to try to bring to you is the international perspective. I'd like to first start with a little humor, because we are talking about economic opportunities. The first one is Che Guevara, and it says, "Even if you spend your whole life combating the forces of capitalism, you still might wind up on a t-shirt sold in a store owned by the Gap." The second presentation, that the comic there, is a therapist who is telling his patient, "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but the true secret to happiness is having more stuff than everyone else." Okay, I see how. So this is the division of the Department of Commerce that I come from. And my presentation is going to address how governments all over the world use procurement to enhance SME, small, medium-sized enterprises, minority small enterprises, veterans-owned enterprises. And my work with the USG is to provide expertise to countries regarding the international commercial law standard, including commercial law standards in government procurement, to help those countries reach their goals of developing small and minority-owned enterprises. The U.S. government sends lawyers from my division to many countries around the world, and we focus on not only educating, but learning the international standard of particular commercial laws. And I look forward to the opportunity to potentially work with some of you in your countries regarding best practices in public procurement. So, if you look around the world, the challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises in public procurement are very similar. Transaction costs, finance, the governments are generally very slow payers, bid preparation costs, bonding costs, costs of obtaining information, regulatory costs, and legal risks. Many small companies do not have the legal counsel, and legal counsel is very expensive in order to handle the risk of government contracting. The next slide is about assisting SMEs. How do governments all over the world, and many of this is familiar to many of you, I am sure. There are really two ways. With preferences, and this includes set-asides of procurement for small enterprises, preferential treatment of small enterprise or minority enterprise bids. Then there's lowering barriers to entry. And this is something that many of you, I am sure, try to do, which is educate and assist small enterprises in the procurement process. Another element of lowering barriers to entry is unbundling, which is very important in the U.S. system, and I imagine it's important for some of your jurisdictions as well. The economists will tell you, if you survey procurement around the world, that the set-aside is the most effective form of supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. Preferential treatment is generally the next most effective. There is evidence that unbundling improves SME opportunities, but it's not quite as powerful as set-asides and preferential treatment. And finally, it's very controversial, but the education and assistance programs are very much in debate as to the value that they bring to SMEs. And I'm going to come back to this when I talk about incentives for small and medium-sized enterprises and larger enterprises to work with small enterprises in the procurement process. Now, I'm going to quickly go over the U.S. procurement process. If you would like to know more about the U.S. procurement process, my hope is that it will remind you of the things that the U.S. may do that you do as well. But we have a federal acquisition regulation. Does anybody know how many pages there are in the U.S. government federal acquisition regulations? There are 2,000 pages. So it's a very difficult thing for a small enterprise to even understand. We have eligibility requirements in the U.S. You have to identify a data universal number, which is a DUNS number. You register with the System for Award Management, the SAM, and then opportunities are available in Fed BizOps. And I want to emphasize that these procurement rules also apply to your small and medium-sized enterprises that want to access the U.S. procurement system. And if you talk to the economists in Washington, they will tell you that with the trade agreements and with the free trade agreements and members of the GPA, of the WTO, that there's a lot of opportunity left on the table by foreign small and medium-sized enterprises in the U.S. procurement process. So, quickly, we have the General Services Administration, and this division of the United States government, and you can learn quite a bit about it by going on their website. Like many of you, we invest very heavily in websites, social media, and the types of things that we can do to contact potential small and medium-sized enterprises, minority enterprises. So the GSA has supply schedules. I assume that many of your countries have something similar, and this is just a list of goods and services provided by GSA-selected vendors, and there's multiple vendors. A very important division of the Office of the General Services Administration is the Office of Small Business Utilization, the OSBU. And they do quite a bit of work to reach out to small and medium-sized enterprises. And I assume that many of you have utilized very similar avenues to reach small enterprises. They have networking opportunities. They have workshops, e-commerce and e-data training, which is extremely important for small companies, particularly now, to be able to take advantage of e-commerce opportunities. They have procurement conferences, and they provide quite a bit of social media assistance, which I think, again, cannot be underestimated in the modern economy. So other divisions of the United States procurement process, we have, as part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Minority Business Development Agency, the MBDA, and their mission is to foster the establishment and growth of minority-owned businesses. They provide management and technical assistance, and you can go to their website to see the types of things that they do for minority-owned businesses, including obtaining government contracts. Now finally, we have the Small Business Administration, which is also housed in the U.S. Department of Commerce, and it provides services and assistance such as training and counseling to small businesses to obtain government contracts. Instead of talking too much about the U.S. procurement process itself, I wanted to talk to you about some market research that I did for this presentation. One of the things that the U.S. procurement process does is it's very effective at reaching its goals of procurement for small and medium-sized enterprises. About 23% of the prime contract dollars of U.S. government procurement go to small and medium-sized enterprises. And if you study the process, it might not be clear why that works. So I talked to companies that are involved in contracting, small and large companies, and to ask them, why does that system in the U.S. work? Well, let me give you an example of how there are incentives for large companies who have quite a bit of technology and knowledge to transfer to small companies. They have a tremendous incentive to work with those small companies. And the small companies have an incentive to work with the larger companies in the U.S. to get government procurement contracts. An example of this is the SBA 8A Business Development Program. The 8A program offers a broad scope of assistance to firms that are owned and controlled at least 51% by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. That 51% is important because that means that 49% of the organization, of the final group that bids for the contract, can be a large organization. And in this program, participants can receive sole source contracts that are relatively small in the U.S. system, $4 million for goods and services and $6.5 million for manufacturing. But it's important to note that the 8A firms are also able to form joint ventures in order to bid for contracts. And they encourage large companies to work with the smaller companies to get contracts. So IBM is a tremendously large company and government contractor in the United States. And I know quite a few people that work for IBM, and I asked them about this incentive. And they said, it's very powerful. When you are a manager at a large company like IBM that gets lots of government contracts, you spend a fair amount of time searching for small business partners. You try to utilize the 8A business process. And the small companies are also looking for you, IBM. So again, it is in practice, it's one of the things that happens in the United States that creates an incentive for small businesses to be able to work with larger businesses and then reduce costs, reduce the cost of learning how to access government contracts. So another system in the U.S. is subcontracting. And the General Service Administration in the United States has a directory published on the GSA for small businesses looking for contracting opportunities with the GSA prime contractors. And prime contractors are required by law to establish plans and goals for subcontracting with small businesses. Another thing I want to talk about is U.S. statutory procurement goals. These are goals that are set out by the federal system, by our Congress, to obtain a % of prime contract dollars for small and medium-sized enterprises. It incorporates small businesses, women-owned small businesses, small disadvantaged businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, and what we call historically underutilized business zones, hub zones. One very important note here, when you look at the figures I'm about to show you, is these goals are not binding. The goals cannot be used as a basis for awarding contracts to small enterprises. But the economists in Washington will tell you having these goals as part of the process of holding bureaucrats and politicians to their job is very effective. So let's see how the US government is doing in terms of its procurement goals. I hope you can see those, but let me just quickly tell you what this chart says. First of all, there are, for small businesses in 2014, the goal was 23%. The goal reached was 24.99%. So we did quite well, or at least reached our goal. Women-owned small businesses was slightly less than the goal. It was 4.68 instead of 5%. And then small disadvantaged businesses, we almost doubled our goal and reached 9.46% instead of 5%. And then with service disabled, we were about our goal. And in what we call the hub zones, we did not do as well as we would like to have. We wanted 3% and we got 1.82%. That gives you an idea of the value and the effectiveness of procurement goals. And it's important to know that the contractors set aside potential bids that they think would be good for small enterprises, but these are based upon dollars. So you don't really know as a contractor whether that is going to get you to your percentage goal. And you can't use your percentage goal as a reason for selecting or setting aside a small enterprise. I want to get back to some of the challenges for any of the more utilized practices in procurement for small and medium-sized enterprises. We talked about set-asides, which are, again, according to The Economist, the most effective way of adding to small and medium-sized enterprise procurement opportunities. But these challenges are significant, particularly if you do not apply some of the advantage policies to your procurement process. Set-asides arguably can reduce competition. They can lead to large companies trying to appear as if they're small, and some will argue that they actually increase prices. Preferential treatment in particular, if it's done incorrectly, can violate WTO, GPA, and free trade agreement criteria. Now, I just want to say about that, because our trade representative wanted to make sure that we did, is that in the WTO GPA, suppliers and contractors are permitted to participate in procurement proceedings without regard to nationality. And if you're a member of a GPA, of the GPA, or if you have an FTA agreement, you can take advantage of these opportunities. But in the United States, by law, if you do not have these exceptions, you cannot be considered for contracts. Another quick point about the whole of government approach and the international perspective on the procurement process, that regardless of what you implement, some of the most important things about procurement is that it is transparent, that it does not have corruption, that it is competitive, and it's focused on highest quality and lowest price. And then small business interests that we talked about before in obtaining government contracts, and you hear this all over the world. Cost and accessibility. They desperately want things to be simpler. The more complicated it is, the more it favors the large companies. And then transparency is extremely important to them, and anti-corruption. Corruption generally favors the larger companies that have larger networks and more money to pay bribes and that type of thing. My last slide, I just want to talk to you about what some other countries do that you may not work with very often. Korea is a success story in government procurement for small and medium-sized enterprises, but they do not use the same bid price preference nor set-asides to encourage SMEs to participate in public procurement. The Korean government provides advance payments to SMEs, loan programs to SMEs. They have an excellent government supply products award that advertises the company's business. And then but they actually also do use multiple award schedules. But they don't use the two largest and most praised mechanisms, set-asides and preferential treatment. That's all I have. I just want to emphasize that in meeting many of you, that there are significant whole of government approaches to these issues. And that's the perspective that I can offer, and I hope I have the opportunity to work with some of you in the coming years. Thank you.